Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what promises to be a really timely and engaging conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pardis Mahdavi. I am the acting dean here at the Korbel School. So let me also take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the Korbel School, to the University of Denver, and for our friends and colleagues who are here from out of town, welcome to Denver. We're very happy you're here with us. So we'll be traveling across the globe in our conversations today and talking about the fallout of the United States' decision regarding the Iran nuclear deal. And we're very pleased to be joined by experts and specialists from our own school who can look at this very complicated issue from a variety of perspectives, from the perspective of the effect of Europe, the effect on Europe and the power of Europe to kind of intervene. Here, Professor Rhodes will be speaking about that, the role of the United States and security, and Professor Goldfischer will be speaking about that. And of course, we're very fortunate to have our own Professor Hashemi. And for those of you who did not see, he and Danny Postal, who we miss very much, authored a fantastic op-ed in the New York Times today. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, definitely do so. I think it's one of the more cogent analyses of the role also of sectarianism and the fallout in the Middle East writ large. I also think this panel is going to be an important connector for many people, thinking about how the events from last week and the way this decision came down last week connect with the events of this week and what we're seeing in Gaza and Jerusalem. And I'm hoping that some of our panelists do speak to that, and I will definitely be posing some questions on that. It's my great honor to moderate this panel. As many of you know, the Middle East is also my area of expertise. I've been working in the Middle East for almost 2 decades now. Iran also is my home country and my area of expertise. My first book was on Iran. And so I'm very excited to be able to be a part of this dialogue as well as a scholar, not just as a dean. So I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. And let me just state at the outset that it's not a ghost sitting there next to David Goldfischer, but Ambassador Gary Grappo will be joining us a little bit later. I believe he's finishing up a class. So he will be joining us as our third speaker. So what we'll probably do is after I introduce the panelists, each of them will speak for between 5 and 10 minutes. And then I will return to the podium to ask a set of questions to our panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So very excited to have this dialogue with everyone in the room. So our first speaker will be Professor David Goldfischer. David Goldfischer is Associate Professor here at the Joseph Korbel School, where he served as Founding Director of the programs in International Security and Homeland Security. Dr. Goldfischer's research has focused on the fields of nuclear policy, human rights, and security, globalization, and security and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. From 2010 to 2013, he served as founding director of the Institute for Civil and International Security at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, UAE. Our second speaker will be Dr. Martin Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes is a distinguished university professor of comparative political economy and European politics, and academic co-director of the Colorado Center of European Union Excellence at the Joseph Korbel School. And we also want to thank both the Europe Center and the Center for Middle East Studies for their co-sponsorship of this event. Dr. Rhodes' research and publications are in comparative and European public policy with a focus on Southern Europe, labor markets, welfare states, banking, and capital markets. Our third speaker will be Ambassador Gary Grappo. Gary Grappo is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies after a long career as a United States diplomat. He's the former ambassador to Oman and a regular columnist for the Fair Observer and the Cipher Brief. He is CEO of Equilibrium International Consulting, which focuses on creating better understandings of the complex issues faced by societies, governments, institutions, and people. And finally, our fourth speaker is our very own Dr. Nader Hashemi, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Korbel School. His most recent book is Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, and his forthcoming book is on Islam and human rights. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel. So Professor Goldfischer, the floor is yours, and I'll try to keep some time by slipping you a note if you don't mind. Yeah, why don't you go? Just trade spots with her. Bit of a dance.
Well, I don't think I'm going to spend the few minutes I have just going over the bad effects of the withdrawal from the Iran deal. I think there's copies of a piece I...
Oh, you got to speak right into it, I think.
Is this better? Yeah. Okay. You can just, though there's copies of the Denver Post piece I did on Sunday. I started right there. I was not planning to do anything, but Trump's speech came on. Unfortunately, I had CNN on. And I found myself hearing just the outrageous lie with which the speech began, which was that Iran was heading toward the point where it could break out and deploy a nuclear weapon. And it simply flew not only against the facts of what is contained in the Iran deal, but against the fact that every member of his own administration, as well as every other expert, confirms that Iran was adhering to the Iran deal. So that Trump didn't even attempt to deploy an argument that had some connection to the truth. He simply launched on one of those lies and then departed from it. And so I can't even remember what I was working on, but I found myself furiously typing just in reaction to that, and just kind of gave, I think, the pretty standard arms controllers reaction to what had just happened. And I think what I'd just like to do is sort of frame this in terms of the different perspectives on U.S. foreign policy that are being brought to bear in terms of either, mainly from outsiders, mainly because what can we say about Trump's approach to U.S. foreign policy? It doesn't follow any rules from any strand of prevailing thought over the past 75 years. It's personal, it's incomprehensible. It departs from the values-oriented tradition, whether the neoconservatives or the liberals, in the sense that it rejects the United States promotion of freedom, of democracy, of universal human rights. It seems in some sense to correspond a bit more to realism, but a central tenet of realism would have been that when Russia interfered with the United States elections, posing a direct threat to sort of the ultimate source of United States security, its democracy, its institutions. He completely, obviously failed to rise to that. He instead covered it up, diverted from it. There's really no way to even connect him to the realist tradition. So I feel sorry for anyone, including myself, who has to teach U.S. foreign policy, because we like to draw on theories and history in order to explain what's going on. And here we just, like everybody else, let this wash over us and attempt to make some sort of a sense out of it, but mainly to complain about it and feel terrible about the implications. In a sense, I think what really got to me about the withdrawal from the Iran deal was there has been one point of agreement in the nuclear age through all administrations from all sorts of different perspectives, and shared by all of the major powers, which was that it would be a bad thing for new states to acquire nuclear weapons. In that sense, non-proliferation theory or anti-proliferation theory has unified or stood apart from, in a unifying way, all other perspectives. And this goes back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, which was reached between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, and extended right to Putin and Obama in recent years. So it's a very natural reaction to aside from all the politics of individual cases, to the common danger posed to humankind by the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Even within that unifying theme, there's been a central point of disagreement, which is how much pressure is it prudent to place on either states which are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, as was Iran, or in cases of countries that have crossed that threshold, like North Korea. That debate also goes back through to almost to the origins of the nuclear era, when President Eisenhower contemplated preventive war against the Soviet Union after they tested, soon after he took office. They had already tested, but the U.S. was in a position to destroy the Soviet Union. Obviously, he made the right decision and decided, but he wondered in his diary about whether he owed it to future generations to do that. But we happen to have, in the case of the Iran deal, a sufficient amount of pressure in the form of economic pressure that actually pushed them, for whatever internal reasons in that regime, over that line, and it was a success. And so in a way, Trump has now removed even the one remaining, and it was hard to even find one sort of consistent view that united all administrations and all political perspectives going back to 1945, and now even that one has been removed. Now, the Iran deal obviously was one important piece, but still only a relatively small piece in the sense of the general problems confronting the region. And all that has, one thing that's been revealed by the pullout from the deal is that there doesn't seem to be any policy, not only by the Trump administration, but some policy waiting in the wings that would begin to address the conflicts in the region, which are inherently bad, but which also affect the security of the entire world, including the United States. And what we've seen is the progressive discrediting of U.S. foreign policy in the region, which began with the realists from 1945 really until 9/11. It was like pure realism. Gulf oil was necessary for the world economy. Any state that did not accept the status quo and which might be expansionist in the region threatened the supply of oil on which the West relied. And the realist policy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, meant support for the friendly so-called dictators of the region who would challenge, who would stand in and contain powers that might have threatened that. First, the Soviet Union. After 1979, Iran was the perceived threat. Then Iraq, of course, after the invasion of Kuwait, became a perceived threat, meaning it would be dual containment of Iran and Iraq. Finally, it was just Iran after the 2003 invasion. But realism really fell by the wayside after 9/11 because the Saudis were our stalwart allies for the entire history, post-1945 history. And yet the attack on the United States came as a result, indirectly and through many steps, but basically from the export of Saudi Wahhabism in reaction to their perceived threat after the Khomeini revolution of the export of Shiism by the Khomeini regime. And that led to just complete disorientation in which the U.S. embraced neoconservatives who believed in the spread of freedom and democracy by force in the region. We now see John Bolton, an unreconstructed neocon, has joined as NSC advisor. The model that he advocated, which was you would use force, you would liberate the country, mystically in a way, since they're conservatives. They don't believe in nation building, economic development, democratic transitions. And we saw the impact of the neocon invasion in Iraq. He's unapologetic about it and presumably is tempted to do the same thing with Iran, perhaps not by force, but through putting economic pressure sufficient for regime change. One would have hoped he would have studied the lessons of Iraq, but there he is as NSC advisor. And the remaining group are the liberals. And the liberals, I think, have also been problematic, as we saw in the Obama administration, where the kind of dove strand of liberalism, going back to the war in Vietnam, believes in the promotion of democracy and human rights, would have liked to see it in the region. We saw Obama's positive reaction initially to the Arab uprisings, but are very cynical about the U.S. use of force. And Trump was able to attack the conservatives, Republicans for invading Iraq, and Obama for withdrawing and for refusing to intervene in Syria. The only remaining strand, the sort of hawkish progressive strand, and Nader and Danny Postel kind of represented that watching 500,000 people die in Syria without a forceful U.S. or Western response is problematic. But that perspective is, in a sense, the most remote with the defeat of Hillary Clinton. And so, we have all the problems that my colleagues will talk about following the collapse of the Iran deal. But I think, in a sense, the longer-term problem is what perspective can be brought to bear to address the deep conflict that now tears apart that region. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so the best way for me to come into this debate is to say something about Europe, its foreign policy capacity, and its ability to act as a counterweight to the US in the international system. And I think it's dubious that Europe can do any of those things, to be honest. So I'm basically going to try and dash the hopes of those among you who imagine that Europe is going to somehow save the deal, because I don't think it can. So the Europeans can be very smug, and there's a lot of hubris about the difference between European foreign policy and US foreign policy. So it's the old argument about, Europeans come from Venus and Americans come from Mars, which is, as nonsensical as it sounds, frankly. But they're very smug about this notion of normative power Europe, which is the idea that you can pursue foreign policy by persuasion and long-term argument, and that you can produce political reform and secure security goals at the same time. So the experience that everyone refers to is Cuba, which Europe has engaged fully with across a range of issues in terms of trade, humanitarian assistance, and so on, which has been quite impressive in terms of the degree to which the European Union has committed to the project, and also a project in which has defied the embargo put in place by the United States. And so why can't Europe do the same with Iran? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, the Cuban project hasn't gone that well, to be honest. The Europeans have spent a lot of money in Cuba, had a lot of meetings, put a lot of effort into promoting European values, political pluralism and respect for democracy, freedom of information, release of political prisoners, but all the way through its relationship under its so-called common position since 1996, the Europeans have to admit now, some 20-odd years later, that most of those other objectives, political pluralism, freedom of expression, clemency for political prisoners and so on, have not been achieved, and the Cubans have pretty much said, we'll take your money, we'll take the trade, but you can't interfere with our domestic politics. And the same process, this idea that Europe is a force for good and can negotiate across multiple issue areas, applies to Iran, where a similar project began in the early 1990s, which was to offer a series of sticks and carrots to the regime. That we would like you not to engage in nuclear proliferation, but we'd also like you to liberalize your political system. We would like you to move towards a more pluralistic political system. We'd like you to respect human rights. We'd like political prisoners and opponents to the regime who have been persecuted to be let up on, a whole series of things. What happened then was that the European Union was pretty much forced to ditch all of those other normative power Europe objectives in order to help secure the 2015 agreement. Now, when we move to the Iranian situation, we begin to see the weakness of European foreign policy more broadly. So not only did you have this kind of background problem of the European Union pursuing multiple objectives at once, some of which turned out to be contradictory. Ultimately, the Iranians weren't interested in talking about political pluralism, and that, as I said, had to be ditched for the Europeans to effectively mobilize behind the 2015 deal. But also, if we look at the process whereby the 2015 deal came about, it's not true, as many people in Europe like to say, that Europe was the key player in securing that 2015 agreement. The reality is that European foreign policy as a European level project had only really been put in place a few years earlier. Catherine Ashton, the British High Representative for Foreign Policy in the EU, who was closely involved in the negotiations leading up to the 2015 deal, was extremely weak vis-a-vis other capitals in Europe. It was still the case then, as it is now, that the European Union has a high representative for foreign policy. It's now Federica Mogherini. But in fact, it's the big countries, the big three, sometimes called the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, who play the critical role in working with the Americans, working with other international foreign policy actors, and you can see that now. I mean, in the wake of Trump's decision to pull out of the agreement, it's the three M's: Merkel, Macron, and May, who are making all the action when it comes to trying to prevent initially Trump from pulling out of the deal, and now talking about possible options that are left open. But Europe as such is relatively weak. In the negotiations of the 2015 agreement, it wasn't the case that Europe secured the deal. It was the Obama regime working through back channels with Iran, and it was Russia which ultimately put in place a plan that was acceptable to the Iranians that dominated the game. The back channel negotiations that the Obama administration engaged in with Iran were not even open to the Europeans. The Europeans didn't even know they were going on. And so in that, if the Europeans start to claim now that it was us who did it, no, it wasn't. The European Union facilitated some negotiations, but ultimately they were not the key actors in securing the deal. So they won't be the key actors in sustaining the deal either. What we now see is a situation in which Europe is really faced with a kind of a momentous decision about whether it's going to be independent of the United States as an international global foreign policy actor or not. And I suggest it won't make that choice, because the position that they will be in is allying with Russia and China against the United States. It has to think about the transatlantic relationship. It has to think about the fact that it's already got a difficult situation with Donald Trump on trade, and doesn't necessarily want to enrage the Trump regime anymore. And it also has to think about the implications for conducting business in the United States if it tries to sustain investments with and trade against possible sanctions with Iran. The economic situation is such that having European business having piled into Iran much more vigorously than the United States, it has everything to lose in business terms from trying to sustain the deal. So total oil, big investments in Iran, Airbus committed to supply 100 planes, already supplied several of them to Iran. These companies and the banks that have facilitated a new commercial relationship with Iran are not going ultimately to succumb to a strategy in which Iran is prioritized in a business sense over a much bigger and longer-term established relationship with the United States. So for all of these reasons, European foreign policy weakness, the fact that Europe has never been the critical player vis-a-vis Iran or the Middle East. And the fact that business will probably dictate abandoning the Iran deal all suggests to me that Europe is not going to save the deal from the attack by Trump. Thank you.
Musical chairs.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start off, first of all, on the Iran agreement, regardless of what you may think about the president's decision, I think it's important to acknowledge that virtually everyone was aware of the deficiencies, in some cases serious deficiencies, that this agreement had. Even the previous administration was fairly transparent about the shortcomings of this agreement. So we're not necessarily debating the ideal agreement versus nothing at all. It was, by universal acclaim almost, an imperfect agreement. So the question becomes, why did the previous administration do this? And it felt it was important that to conclude this agreement for one clear reason, that what was possible in terms of reductions, limitations, and transparency was better than the alternative of no deal. And in any negotiation, you have to look at a deal, less than the perfect deal, or nothing at all. And the administration, led by President Obama, decided that an imperfect deal was better. Now, one of the hopes and identified by many people as a false hope on which the president and his administration based this agreement was that by getting it, we could then begin to improve the broader relationship between the United States and Iran. And it was a false hope. We now know that. We've seen Iran's behavior, whether it's ballistic missile testing or its involvement in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere, its continuing support of Hezbollah. So it was a false hope. But President Trump has made his decision based on an equally false hope, that renewed pressure on Iran will force Iran back to negotiations for a better deal. In the words of one observer, Iran is not a nation in some pre-revolutionary phase. It's not even close. Its economy is certainly weak, but it's not crumbling. Its population is certainly restive, but it's not marching every day in the streets the way it was doing in 1979. And the regime certainly has fissures within it, without question. But its military and security services are actually quite solid. Iran and the Iranian people are well acquainted with hardship and sacrifice. Witnessed the devastating 8-year war with Iraq, 1980 to 1988, and 38 years of sanctions imposed by the United States and the United Nations. Sanctions that will probably be far more harsh than what the president can do today. Whereas the Iranian people may have looked upon the United States previously, this is under the agreement, as their hope for rejoining the international community at some future point, they're now more likely to circle the wagon around a regime they would prefer not to have, and possibly hope for normalcy, and the possible hope for normalcy is postponed indefinitely. So the United States have effectively taken a problem that was under control and manageable, if only temporarily, and now elevated it back to a crisis. How are we better off with that? The reality with regard to our sanctions is that the U.S. Sanctions that might be reimposed are unlikely to be followed, not even by our best of friends, including the Atlantic Alliance countries. But one, probably even more critically, than the agreement itself, in terms of fallout, is the damage that's been done to the transatlantic alliance. The United States effectively rejected personal appeals by the leaders of our closest allies in Europe. And those appeals also included some extraordinary measures that they were willing to take to make this agreement stronger. The president could have walked away, pocketed those, and kept the agreement in place and shown that he had negotiated, in fact, a better agreement than his predecessor had. And we chose to reject all of those. And so it's going to be very, very hard, in my view, to get these countries, and I'm speaking of the EU countries, but principally Britain, France, and Germany, to join our new sanctions, to which I will get in a moment. So it erodes the trust that they have in the United States and our collective ability to address major global crises. So with whom do we work now to address this still very real challenge of Iran's potential nuclear weapons development? And I have to believe that Russia and China were delighted to see the president's decision. With regard to oil, it's important to keep in mind that four of the top 6 importers of Iranian oil, China, India, Korea, and Japan, are unlikely to curtail their imports, as the cost to their economies would be far too great. And they also happen to be key trading partners or allies of the United States. And other significant oil importers, Turkey, Italy, Spain, and France, are NATO allies of the United States. So rather than impose sanctions on these nations, for which oil is considered a strategic necessity, the United States may have to find workarounds or simply ignore their, quote, violations. In any event, Iranian crude sales were already starting to shift toward Asia, where the market opportunities were greater, and of course now the threat of sanctions is less. Now, reimposing U.S. sanctions is not simply a matter of dusting off those imposed before the JCPOA. We have to recall that the sanctions that we had imposed were a culmination of the work of 2 administrations over more than a decade. These are the efforts of multiple departments within the United States government, the Energy Department, the Treasury Department, State, Defense, the Justice Department, the CIA, and numerous other intelligence agencies. And it was all done to craft very targeted sanctions against organizations and entities and individuals in Iran involved in their nuclear weapons development. And it was because we had such a persuasive argument with that effort that we got so many of them to join with our sanctions regime. And by the way, they also contributed the intelligence that they had available to themselves. Now, there's going to be a major obstacle in imposing nuclear sanctions today, because all these countries acknowledge that Iran is abiding by the nuclear agreement. In fact, even the United States has acknowledged that Iran is abiding by the nuclear agreement. So how do you reimpose nuclear-related sanctions on hundreds of entities? The United States will face terrific challenge in imposing a sanctions regime that it expects to bring significant pressure to bear to bring Iran back to the negotiating table. I will also say, just in closing, that the one hope is that President Trump can negotiate something, and as of last night, it's probably a dwindling hope, with North Korea. Because if he could negotiate something like that, and I don't know what the odds are, certainly less today than they were this time yesterday, that might make an impression on the Iranian leadership. Otherwise, the president is left with now dealing with the problem. And I characterize this the way Secretary Colin Powell often talked about Iraq and invoking the Pottery Barn rule. You break it and you own it. Iran, for all the blame he placed on the previous administration, is now Donald Trump's problem?
Well, thank you all for coming. The decision by Donald Trump to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement has been described in the following terms: an act of political vandalism, the single most destructive U.S. foreign policy decision since Bush's 2003 decision to invade Iraq, and one of the greatest acts of self-sabotage in America's modern history. I agree with all of those characterizations. What I want to speak about in the next 10 minutes is to provide you with somewhat of a different reading on why I think this nuclear agreement has value, why I supported it, and why I think there's cause for deep concern now that it looks like this agreement is about to die, leading us to the path toward a military confrontation with Iran. The standard arguments that we heard about why we have to have this nuclear agreement are ones that have been sort of implied already by my fellow colleagues and that have been very much discussed in the public sphere. Iran is a rogue nation. It is frequently referred to as the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. It's a destabilizing player in the region. If it gets a nuclear weapon, it might drop it on Israel. It would potentially be a game changer for the future of our planet, according to some narratives. I'm not convinced by those arguments. Yes, Iran is a destabilizing player. It's an authoritarian regime. In Syria, it is deeply complicit in massive war crimes and crimes against humanity that have killed roughly 500,000 people, but it's not the only destabilizing element and player in the region. And I don't think if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, hypothetically, that it would signify the end of the world, and I don't think they would actually try to drop it on Israel. The reason why I supported the Iran nuclear deal, and still do, are not for those reasons, but was primarily because of the positive effects that it would have on creating better conditions within Iran for political development and democratization. And now that this agreement is dying and is almost dead, I think those gains that I think have been registered, and you won't know this unless you actually study internal Iranian politics, those gains are now about to be rolled back. And so that's why I think there is deep cause for concern with respect to the future political prospects for democracy in Iran that are now in jeopardy because of the ending of this nuclear agreement. So if you study democratic transitions, there are sort of preconditions that social scientists regularly point to that we look for in terms of the possibility of a country experiencing a democratic transition: a suitable political culture that supports democratic ideas, the existence of a middle class, a certain level of modernization related to literacy, education, access to information. All of these things, if you look at them, are in play in Iran today. Critically, the society is also experiencing deep and massive social discontent over the state of politics, the state of the economy. The revolution is about to experience its 40th anniversary, and on the 40th anniversary, the regime is experiencing a massive and significant crisis of legitimacy, particularly in the eyes of its young people. There are major intra and inter-elite rivalries that are significant, not just between reformists and hardliners, but among hardliners themselves. All of those things bode well for the possibility of, not in the immediate term, but not in the short term, but in the medium term, for the political change. There were major protests that rocked Iran in January, made major news. 80 cities, towns, and villages were affected by this. According to official figures, 42,000 people were rounded up. Most of them were young people. 5 people were killed in jail. It shocked the political establishment in Iran. Since then, there have been ongoing smaller scale protests. Teachers have been protesting over wages, farmers over decline of water access, ethnic groups over discrimination, women over hijab, mandatory hijab, and demands for civil rights. The inter-elite rivalry among the hardliners is actually quite interesting. A group of hardliners wrote an open letter to the supreme leader, their leader, saying that the regime faces a crisis of political legitimacy. Senior clerics are warning each other that if we're not careful, we'll all be thrown into the sea if there's a revolution. The political legitimacy crisis that the regime is facing is really evident if you actually look at several indicators. Iran ranks actually near the top of the world in terms of the number of intellectuals and journalists that are in prison. That tells you something. They can't sustain an open battle and debate on political ideas. There is increasing censorship, attempts to stop social media access, crackdown on dual nationals. Arrests and intimidations have increased, ironically, after the signing of the nuclear deal, and this is an indication that the hardliners are panicking. They're fearful that President Rouhani's attempt to engage the world will actually be successful. They lobbied very hard against the nuclear deal. They've been bolstered by Donald Trump's recent decision. There's open calls for a referendum, supervised referendum in Iran to determine the future course of the country. There's a lot of examples that I could point to. I can talk more about this in terms of the evidence. It's actually a topic of a future book project, the crisis of legitimacy that the Islamic Republic is facing. Society in Iran over the last 2 decades has undergone a major transformation, a major intellectual transformation of ideas. The battle for ideas, I would argue, is over in Iran, and it's been overwhelmingly won by reformist and democratic voices. The regime cannot sustain an open battle and dissemination over political ideas, because they know it will lose, particularly among the young people who aspire to a more open, democratic, and liberal society. The desire for political secularism is significant. The desire for political change, albeit non-violently, is a core theme that I think most Iranians agree upon. They don't want another Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. The desire for gender equality, many of the leading voices in Iranian civil society and Iran's pro-democracy movement are women. Shirin Ebadi, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Nargis Mohammadi, Zahra Rahnavard. These are women who have popularity, who are principled, who are leading this. Now, all of these, I think, transformations and gains that have been registered are now threatened by Donald Trump's decision. Increasing sanctions are going to force the middle class. Well, the middle class will be most affected by new sanctions. The currency has declined significantly in the last few weeks. Almost a third of its value has declined. The value of the Iranian currency has declined by 1/3 in recent weeks. This affects primarily not the regime, not the Revolutionary Guards, but precisely those segments in society that are at the core of the civil society movements and the middle class that I think will lead Iran to political change. Freedom to survive will take over as sanctions start to bite, will take over and take precedence over social organizing and resisting the regime's policies. As we head toward war, I suspect there is going to be a declaration of a national emergency, will be called state repression will increase. Civil society spaces, the few that do exist, will be completely shut down. Hardliners will exploit the theme of imperialism and nationalism to rally people around the flag. Inter-elite differences will be patched up as they call on the nation to come together to face common external threats from the Americans, the Saudis, and the Israelis. And the regime's legitimacy will actually be bolstered by Donald Trump's decision and plan to play hardball with Iran. So the key point here that I'm trying to convey, one of the, I think, deep negative consequences is that the Trump decision will significantly set back these very important gains that have been very significantly registered and do bode well in terms of the prospects for political change in Iran. There is actually an added point that David referred to, is that Donald Trump actually does have a plan B. I think it's really his plan A, and that is very much the plan for regime change. If you listen to what his closest advisors are saying, Bolton, Pompeo, Giuliani, the plan very much is to do what the neocons did in the 1990s leading up to the Iraq War. This is openly being discussed. It's very much part of their worldview. And they've allied themselves with this extremist Iranian cult known as the MEK that most Iranians despise. I mean, if they had to Iranians had to choose between the MEK, this cult that Bolton is getting money from, and the current regime, I think most Iranians would choose the current regime. So this is very much, I think, what we are in store for, and why the ending of this nuclear agreement is a deeply catastrophic, I think, move that will undermine the internal prospects for political change in Iran. There is a deeper history here that I don't have time to talk about, but I'll just end on this note, that unfortunately every time in Iran's 100-year history when there's been a moment and a prospect for political change, democratic change, from the constitutional revolution to the mid-1950s oil nationalization movement to the Iranian Revolution and beyond, U.S. foreign policy has taken positions that have undermined significantly, sometimes directly and massively, the prospects for political change. The key event that really set the stage for the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was the CIA coup d'etat that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and toppled an internal democratic process that was in place in Iran in the 1950s, and it looked like it might have been successful. Everyone in this room has to stop and ask themselves, because most people here are American citizens, and it was American tax dollars that funded that coup. Where might Iran be today if that coup d'etat was not successful and democracy was allowed to take its natural course in Iran? How different might Iran be today? How different might the Middle East be today? How different might the Islamic world be today if there was a democratic country in the heart of the region that was allowed to undergo a democratic transition based on its own internal development, and its political trajectory wasn't subverted by the United States? We're seeing these forces once again come into play in Iran. And then people wonder and scratch their heads, why is there so much anti-Americanism in the Middle East? Why don't the Iranians love us? Well, if you have any sense of history, I think you'll be able to understand why there is a lot of criticism of the United States, both for its past policies that I've briefly referred to, and also the current policies that we're seeing today under the leadership of Donald Trump. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for giving us quite a lot of food for thought and for discussion. So I just have a couple of questions that I'm going to pose, and feel free to jump in as you'd like to sort of dialogue about this. The first question, so as you know, I'm an anthropologist, and I've been studying Iran on the ground since 2000. And we've had a lot of conversations at the kind of macro level. Nader, you started to take us kind of closer in. But I'm wondering if you might be willing to dialogue with me a little bit on the effects of this decision on the lives of what I call everyday Iranians. And the New York Times had a recent article that came out. It was called Normal Life for Iranians, in which that reporters very cogently kind of went through the everyday lives of a few people that he had spoken with. I think about my interlocutors, who were part of the sexual revolution that I wrote about in the early 2000s, then part of the Green Movement in 2009, then part of #MyStealthyFreedom, #Enough, and kind of the role of this new kind of state of crisis, if you will, on the lives of everyday Iranians, how that's affecting the lives of everyday Iranians, and what that does to the spirit of reform. I think, Nader, you spoke really beautifully on, how the United States has undermined most efforts at reform. And I'm thinking specifically now about the youth movement, the hopes that they had pinned to Rouhani and to the deal. And I'm wondering if you can just reflect briefly along with me, because this is something I've been reflecting on as I've been getting frantic texts and Facebook messages, pretty much on a daily basis for the last week, dialoguing about what is their life like? What is the life like for these young people who put their lives on the line every single day and who now fear a very different existence?
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing from Iranians on the ground and the ones that you have studied with and interviewed is the following, that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. They're caught between an oppressive authoritarian regime that's trying to control their lives on the one hand, and on the other hand, once again, the international community, this time led by Donald Trump, is trying to impose more sanctions on them. Where do you go from there? And so there's deep despair, deep disillusionment. Anyone who can get out is trying to leave. Those people who make their living in Iran and have to convert currency are now in a huge dilemma because the value of the currency has dropped, and so they're struggling financially. They can't come to the United States because Donald Trump, who claims that he wants to support regime change because he wants to help help the people of Iran, at the same time as banning Iranians from coming to this country under the travel ban. So that tells you a lot. And so it's just I think there's a lot of fatigue, disillusionment, apathy. That is slowly starting to seep in. And of course, the irony of all of this is this bolsters the regime because they benefit from this circumstance where people no longer think about organizing and resisting, they just think about survival. And the regime, I think, gets a boost from that.
Thank you. My second question is more probably geared towards Martin, and you talked about the role of Europe here. I'm wondering if you could reflect for all of us on this question of could this unify or divide Europe? Kind of, some people might want to go in one direction, some people might want to go in the other. And the second part of that question is, Trita Parsi had a very intriguing tweet this morning, which some of you may have seen. For those of you who don't know, Trita is the head of the National Iranian American Council, and he had a very intriguing tweet, where he was calling for Europe to sanction Trump's businesses. And says spare American companies but hit Trump's economic empire and Trump will cave. That was a direct call to Europe to do a targeted sanctioning. I'm wondering if you can reflect on both of those.
Sorry, what was the first?
The first one is, could this unify or divide Europe?
Well, I think that on foreign policy issues, if Germany, Britain, and France reach a position, then the others will fall into line.
But what if they disagree?
If they disagree,
with
then
each other.
No. If they disagree, and they have in the past. I mean, before the 2015 agreement, France was actually worried that the Obama administration was being too soft.
Mm-hmm.
France actually wanted a different solution, a kind of a sanctions lifting only when progress was made, rather than just pulling everything away at once. So the possibility for division is absolutely there, but I think that the main problem is that a little bit like the Iranian people, Europe's between a rock and a hard place. Right? So does it oppose Trump? Does it therefore risk secondary sanctions on its companies? Does it risk then being identified as an ally of Russia and China against the US and the Middle East? It's a very difficult situation. On the idea that you might punish American companies is kind of
Trump.
It ignores it ignores the fact that international business now is so integrated across nations, especially across the transatlantic, that separating out American from European business is virtually impossible. So, for example, the Airbuses that have been sold to include American parts.
Right, they do.
And because international supply chain manufacturing now involves bits from all over the place. And so you can't say, okay, we're going to punish American companies. In many cases, you'd just be punishing yourself.
Right.
So the scope for using economic pressure on the United States is virtually non-existent. So no, that's not going to happen.
This is an invitation to anyone on the panel. I spoke at the outset a little bit about connecting what happened with the Iran deal to the violence this week that we've observed in Gaza. And a lot of people have made those connections, and a lot of people have been dialoguing about that, and certainly what transpired on Wednesday as well. Wondering if you all can reflect on these connections and what that means for stability in kind of varying parts of the Middle East. And then what that means for the Gulf. I mean, that's something that, again, my area, I also work on the Gulf, and the Gulf is also caught between a rock and a hard place, right? And so thinking about the connection between Trump pulling out of the Iran deal and Gaza, as well as, what that does for stability in the Middle East. Anyone want to comment?
It's very hard to specify the connection because yeah, I don't think so. Maybe,
I think you have a
You
switch
have
on.
to turn it on.
I think there's a switch on the.
There is.
Oh, there it is.
Ah. Let's see. Is that on now? No. You could pass that one along.
Use this one. Just watch the car.
Exactly. It's very hard to kind of empirically describe the connection you're suggesting. And I think you can make it to Trump and Netanyahu. I think you can make it to Trump and Putin. I think you can, Trump's obvious support for Marine Le Pen in the elections in Europe. That when there's a sense, you can think of in the post-Cold War phase, when the sense that the promotion of universal human rights and democracy was the wave of the future. Even when force was used, say, against Milosevic over the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, and there was a huge nationalist reaction in Belgrade with people standing on bridges to prevent U.S. bombing and so on. But when all was said and done, under the punishment of that campaign, people turned against Milosevic, and he ended up in a war crimes trial. There was a sense that the West was on the rise. I think under Obama, we saw the early signs that the West was weakening. Netanyahu was able to play Netanyahu by siding with the Republican Party, which was a completely unprecedented intrusion by a foreign leader into American domestic politics, and get away with it. And at the very end, when Kerry gave the speech calling for a two-state solution and recognizing Palestinian rights as well as Israeli rights, Trump was intervening as president-elect to go against the U.S. vote in the United Nations. So that, again, you can draw this connection or that connection, but what's really going on is all of one piece. Trump is very happy to challenge, as Martin was describing, the European allies because he opposes the West in the sense of the values that it stands for, just as he was unwilling to, for months and months, to endorse Article 5 of NATO, that the U.S. would even involve itself in the defense of Europe. So it's in that general sense of a transnational struggle between liberalism and this rising tide of anti-liberalism that we've seen all sorts of authoritarian types, bullies, thugs, finding solace in what the direction that the United States has taken, and everybody else looking on in horror.
Let me just add something to that. I think the connection that David just alluded to between what's happening in Gaza and what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal, the obvious connection is Donald Trump. The policies that he's pursuing are radicalizing and destabilizing the region, embracing, in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, basically the Netanyahu regime that is, in my view, surrounded by and deeply infected by neo-fascist elements within his cabinet who have deeply racist views toward Palestinians. And just the images yesterday, the contrast between the celebration in Jerusalem, this festivity, and then 30 miles away, people are being shot dead by live ammunition, as if, and those things are basically part of one story. So there's that happening, which will have, the events in Gaza will deeply, I think, radicalize not just the Palestinians, but Arabs and Muslims. And it'll be much more easier for extremist elements to, recruit people to their narrative, because they will say, look at the double standards. The West doesn't believe in its own human rights claims. Look at what Trump is doing. Look at what's happening in Gaza. Don't believe that worldview. The only option you have if you want to change your plight is to come over to our radical narrative. So it'll radicalize the region. The Iranian regime and hardliners in particular, if you follow what they're saying right now, benefit from what Trump is doing because they spin a similar narrative. And they say, look, don't believe in human rights, don't believe in universal values. The West doesn't even believe it themselves. And the case example is the plight of the Palestinians. Look what's happening right now on the streets of Gaza. And so Iran's foreign minister is tweeting about what's happening in Gaza and saying it's, a horrendous human rights tragedy. Of course, it's complete hypocrisy on his part to invoke human rights given what Iran is doing in Syria. But these are the narratives that are being spun by these authoritarian regimes and authoritarian elements. And so the net result is that I think it simply radicalizes the region. It increases, I think, the propaganda options that authoritarian regimes have at their disposal. Although, so the Iranian regime will say, don't criticize us for human rights and what we're doing domestically. Look what you are supporting in Israel and in Palestine. And for some Iranians, that argument does have a resonance. So I think all things together, this is just more proof and a reminder in many ways that, the United States of America, for better or for worse, is still the most important player in the international system. Who the president is deeply matters. What the United States does at any moment in time matters in terms of, the effects on the global system. And we're seeing it playing out right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the sad bit about that, and I completely agree with you, Nader, that hardliners have unfortunately been empowered through all this, right? And every time I think that young people who are part of the reform movement feel like they're making some gains, something like this happens, which gives the hardliners all the fuel that they need to continue to sort of maintain their power, and it really undermines the organic efforts of reform. I think there's been a couple of Iranian commentators in the past, which was, when people would ask, what should the United States do vis-a-vis Iran? People say nothing, like get out, leave it alone, so that these organic movements can run their course. But when this kind of intervention is spun, it makes it very difficult for the organic regime change, and that is the kind of regime change you would want, is the organic regime change. So you don't have a repetition of 1953. That those efforts are hampered. I think another sort of byproduct of the hardliners taking control of the narrative with Gaza is the very sad reality that it is a humanitarian crisis. It is a human rights crisis. But when the hardliners take control of that narrative, we see the hypocrisy instead of seeing what a tragedy it is and how it is that we got to this point, right? And I think it's important not to lose sight of that, of just the tragedy of the violence that's occurring there. So just sort of my last question to the panel, where do we go from here? Right? Where do we go from here? I mean, we're all, a lot of people, Europe's caught between a rock and a hard place. Iranians are caught between a rock and a hard place. The Gulf is caught between a rock and a hard place. So where do we go as experts in these fields to start to get people out from between those rocks?
Well, so this isn't on either. Oh, it is. So I think the struggle in Europe is the same as in the United States, and ultimately it will have an impact on foreign policy towards this very difficult region in the Middle East. And I think that common struggle is against what Nader was talking about, the rise of political illiberalism everywhere, and against the formation of networks between far-right neo-fascist movements across the world. So, we have the peculiar, some of the things that are happening at the moment are so peculiar, they beg a belief. But, Netanyahu is deep in with the illiberal regime in Hungary, and has actually been involved in in helping the anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros, which is just unbelievable. And neo-fascist movements across Europe have been have visited Israel. People, the neo-fascist types in the Netanyahu administration, because although their history is deeply anti-Semitic, they now think they can strike common cause against Islam. And so you have, and of course the people in the American administration share some of these conceptions about the world, and the anti-Western liberal order instincts of Trump are, based in these, I wouldn't call it populist, but neo-fascist notions about the supremacy of certain kinds of people versus other kinds of people. And it's in fighting against that in domestic politics that we have to, is the only real way to deal with this bigger problem.
Thank you. That's very good.
a school of international studies, and we're all experts in one aspect or another of international studies. But in terms of this tide of anti-liberalism, if one thing, and as Nader was saying, the United States remains the most important player. And if you think back to the last time, and a worse time, when the very survival of liberalism was under challenge, the 1930s, when, or if you go to 1940, when Europe had fallen and only England stood, the United States had this burgeoning America First movement with fascist and isolationist and a range of other elements arrayed against the idea of the United States standing for liberalism. It was the United States, obviously, that turned the tide. It was absolutely essential. And again, we're not in that dire a situation right now, but there is that rising tide of anti-liberal forces. And in a way, I think inevitably it will be decided inside the United States. And so I think it's not just experts in American studies, and it's of course within a global context, but it is actually what we do here, most of us as American citizens, to reverse that tide, because this assault on liberalism has now come home.
Thank you so much. Did you want to weigh in?
Just a quick comment.
There we go.
It's working. During the campaign, there was a very insightful piece written about Donald Trump. I can't recall by whom or where it appeared, about how he had functioned as a businessman and what to look out for if he were elected president. And he operates, and it's been very, very clear since he's moved into the White House, he's a disruptor. Everywhere he goes, he disrupts. He takes the chess table and turns it upside down. He did it with the TPP. He did it with the Paris Climate Accords. We're not sure what he's going to do with NAFTA, but it's a point of considerable concern for businesses in Canada, Mexico, and our own country. And now he's done it with the Iraq nuclear accord. And the contention of this writer was almost like a psychoanalytical piece of how Donald Trump operates. He creates and sows disruption where he goes. And having created all of this, the result, at least in the case when he ran businesses, where he became the only solution. Now things are a little different with him being president of the United States. There are others who have a voice and who have cards to play. But in terms of what happens next, there is no independent voice within his cabinet. People talk about Secretary of Defense Mattis, and he seems to be off doing his own thing at the Defense Department without too much interference from the president. If, and God forbid when, he might be called upon to activate some military plans, we'd have to see what Secretary of Defense Mattis would do. But for the time being, when it comes to U.S. policy, it's centering on Donald Trump and Donald Trump only. Even our own Congress, with a few exceptions, has apparently abjured in many, many cases. And as I said, the Iran agreement was extremely contentious, and even folks within the Obama administration had recognized it. And he had victory in his hand, that he could have gone to his supporters and said, look what I got, that the previous administration did not get. And so now we're beginning to see a little bit of that destructive element, trait of Donald Trump. And it is cause for alarm in the case of Iran, if Iran restarts, and that's a big if Iran actually restarts its nuclear weapons development program. And it may choose not to do that. it could just amble along without doing that, retaining the option, keeping in place whatever economic arrangements it's able to manage, given the fact that many countries will not respect the U.S. sanctions, particularly in Asia. And there will be no need, particularly when public opinion, first time in memory that I can recall, is on the side of Iran now. That they look like the good guy in this encounter.
Thank you so much. So we have just a few moments now for opening it up for questions. And maybe what we'll do is just take 3 questions in succession, and then folks can jump in. So yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yeah.
So I kind of wonder. I kind of wonder if, like, say Donald Trump has like a Christmas Carol moment, you know, and he's visited, you know, by 3 ghosts and wakes up in the morning. He's like, oh my God, what have I done? You know, or if that happened, say, you know, right before the inauguration, you know, even to like give a different sort of spin on it. I mean, like, what could he really do? I mean, like, obviously, don't pull out of the Iraq or the Iran deal. You know, don't move the embassy to Jerusalem. But like, in a broader context for like the whole Middle East, like, what could he really do? Because it seems like his perception is pretty constant. It doesn't really seem like, you know, as an actor, he would really be supported no matter what he would do. And so I feel like, you know, a lot of this is kind of idle. You know, is he like the actual disease, or is he just a symptom of a larger problem that's going on in the world right now? You know, is any of this really Donald Trump specific, or is it just, you know, these are problems that have been going on for a while? You know, Professor Goldfischer mentioned, you know, even as far back as the Obama administration, you know, there was this, you know, problem where the sort of norms of like the West rising were sort of starting to falter. You know, it seems like there's been a bigger pattern going on for a longer time. You know, Donald Trump certainly isn't helping, and if anything, he's accelerating the problems, but like the problems have been there. So that would be my, you know, what could he really do, I guess? You know, what if you could walk up to Donald Trump today and be like, do this, you know, like, what would you say to him?
Okay. Well, let's, Alan. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good panel, but it's very hard to talk today because it's very hard to talk today. I'm a Jew. There's a mass nonviolent movement in Gaza and occupied territory. There are 2 million citizens, 1 million of them are children. A mass nonviolent movement has been shot down, to say that it's disproportionate, by Israeli snipers who are fascists. And Netanyahu is now cooperating with fascists. And Ivanka and Jared, particularly Ivanka, that empty smile just became the face of America. Now, I agree with many things that have been said, particularly what Martin said at the end, and what Nader was trying to say, except I want to say that it's a question for all of us, which side are you on? This runs the danger of nuclear war. If civilians can be killed in the way they are there, then the threat Trump made once upon a time to North Korea about wiping out 25 million civilians in which he wasn't locked up, right, for being crazy, by a decent place, turn it to Iran. We're going to launch a war with Iran with these crazy people, these crazy racist people. It could easily escalate to something that will make the planet uninhabitable. Now, I think that we could prevent this by really working on a new form of American foreign policy by fighting for it. And I heard Bernie Sanders talk about it at a town hall that was broadcast all over the country without being on television 2 nights ago, which is no regime change. I think America ought to get out of the business of regime change. And ought to stop trying to push everybody else around. Unless it's for decency, I have no objection whatsoever for interviewing for human rights. It's just that I can't tell when we do it, because we seem in so many places not to do it. But I think meditating on the people who were killed, and meditating on what led people who are allegedly associated with what is good in the West, as far as I can see, this is colonialism, might help get through this. I find this 7 Israeli leaders, including Avraham Berg, and maybe you can meditate on this isn't counterparts, issued a statement comparing what was done to the Sharpeville massacre. Now, I think that's dead accurate. As a Jew, I would say it reminds me of the Warsaw Ghetto. I think this is so terrible a thing I just can't say. And I don't feel that the way we have yet gotten to addresses how shocking this is, and not just for Muslims who are the victims, but for all of us who are decent human beings who love human rights, as they would say.
Thank you, Alan. One more. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Nader, for bringing up Operation Ajax, which was the 1953 CIA-backed coup, because the democratically elected Mossadegh was nationalizing the oil, taking it away from the power of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became BP. So that overthrow is historic. It's admitted. But my question concerns who has the right to do these interventions, these military and sanctions, etc., because we know that Colin Powell lied about weapons of mass destruction, fractured that country totally to 1,000 pieces, and those countries actually were planned to be invaded. 5 weeks after 9/11, General Wesley Clark, you can look all this up, 5 weeks after 9/11, General Wesley Clark, who was the head supreme commander of NATO, in 2007 publicly disclosed that 5 weeks after 9/11, there were U.S. military plans to invade 7 countries within 5 years. He was at the Pentagon. Those countries were Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Libya, and ending with Iran. So there's an agenda behind these so-called wars, which are actually wars of aggression. And the other factor is the Bank of International Settlements. All of these countries that Clark named, General Clark named, they have their own independent central banking system. They're not part of the World Bank or the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. So it's about financial control, oil and resource, gas and mineral resource control, and endless profits from endless wars. So the ultimate question is, what right does the United States have to intervene when we are the ones that have bombed innocent civilians, civilian populations, i.e. Japan, and interfered in democratically elected countries over and over again throughout the world?
Thank you. Let's have our panelists respond to all three.
Okay, I'll offer some remarks. Let me say a few things that ties together the three questions, and it goes back to the comments that were made just before we went to the Q&A session. I think if we desire a better U.S. foreign policy that can deal with the question of Gaza, or that can deal with the question of the Iran nuclear deal, or can deal with other international issues, there's no way of dealing with those international issues unless we fix what is deeply broken in the United States, and that's our own democracy. That's the focus. There's a major election coming up in November. It has the potential of impeaching the president. There'll be an election after that. I think the focus, if you care about all of these different issues internationally, and you really want to do something about them as an American citizen, I think we're at this unique historic moment where the focus has to be on the internal. Because unless we, and I want to emphasize also, it's not simply fixing the internal broken democracy that we have where we go back to a Hillary Clinton or back to an Obama. If you think that if Hillary Clinton would have gotten elected last time, what a wonderful world it would be, you don't understand what's going on. The problems in terms of domestic American politics, the polarization, the economic crisis, the anxiety that led many people to vote for Trump is much deeper than simply going back to the Democratic Party and hoping another iteration of Obama or Hillary Clinton will do good things for this country, to say nothing about the international U.S. foreign policy dimension of it. So there are deep problems, and I think these deep problems, as bad as they are domestically and as bad as the U.S. foreign policy scene is under the leadership of Donald Trump, I think there's also room for optimism because this is such a crisis moment. There is mobilization. There's a lot of interest. I'm going to reveal my own cards here. I think there's an option now of me getting someone who has decent policies elected because there's a lot of soul searching. Someone who has policies along the lines of, Bernie Sanders. He won 22 states. He had zero financial backing. Young people mobilized around his agenda. He's the most popular politician in the United States. You know, I think I don't agree with everything that he says on foreign policy. Actually, I'm critical of him on many issues, but I think there's a chance to fix in the next coming years. And if we don't fix it now, I think then, you know, we are really headed down a road where things are really going to start to unravel both domestically and internationally.
I don't have much to add. What I would say, though, as a non-American, I am a legal resident, I hasten to add. But as I'm not a left Democrat. I'm not even a European leftist. I'm a centrist on most issues. But what I would say is that the U.S. Republican Party, because of the peculiar dynamics of the U.S. political system, in part, has become an extremist far-right party in recent years, and that's a huge problem for any democracy. I mean, the polarization in the United States is really the polarization that's created by the Republican Party moving right and abandoning the center and responding to a small and unrepresentative base, and that was pre-Trump. So this is a problem that lies deep within the Republican Party, and I think that the Republican Party has become the U.S. Republican Party has become one of the major threats, not just to this country but to the international system, and that will take a lot to deal with. It takes a lot of mobilization against. And it won't go away even if Trump loses power. And I don't have any solution for that, but I think that in the future, people are going to have to begin to rectify the flaws in American democracy, the lobbying system, the primary system. These are all the Electoral College. These are all things that have to be reformed, institutional reforms, therefore. If we're going to ultimately solve these problems.
Yeah.
Again, here we are at the School of International Studies agreeing that the United States and what goes on here is the absolutely critical issue. And on discussion of intervention, there's no time to start rehearsing the whole history of what terrible things the United States has done, and in some cases good things the United States has done. But if you just return to that region where we started this discussion, and you see absence any liberal force or a state with liberal values that has force behind it, we see the region really being torn apart. We have the old Russian Empire with authoritarianism of Putin, the old Ottoman Empire with Erdogan, the authoritarian and sectarian regimes of Iran and Saudi Arabia. When you have competing authoritarianisms all using identity politics to define their interests, there is no hope for peace, and there's no hope for the advance of universal human rights. So wherever it is that a force supportive of those values can triumph within the domestic politics of that state, you have added another force to counter those authoritarianisms. And as Nader said, it is nowhere more important for those forces to prevail inside the United States. But that doesn't mean these battles aren't going on right now throughout Western Europe, Eastern Europe, really worldwide. But again, as my colleagues have agreed, this struggle in the United States now is really the key.
Do you want to weigh in?
No.
Okay, great.
Well, we're actually out of time. I think our panelists will be generous enough to stay for a couple moments for those of you who didn't get your questions answered. But I do want to take another opportunity to thank this incredibly outstanding panel for coming together so quickly and offering such cogent remarks on a very complicated situation. So thank you.